Hi, I'm Ashwin. I'm the CEO of the event production company and the founder of Whisper Loudly. Whisper Loudly is a talk show that's about basically creating insights, allowing people the freedom to speak up and inspire others to move forward and create a better world for all. And today I'm really excited. I have Marc Kahn with me, and we are going to talk about the transition of leadership thinking in the 21st century. Marc is the Global Head of People and Organisation at Investec, a FTSE 250 company with over 8,000 employees in 32 countries worldwide. He's also a visiting professor at the Middlesex University of London, and the author of the book, Coaching on the Axis. Marc, from my research, I see that you talk about the 20th century as a cog in the wheel. And then you talk about the 21st century as humanization. Now, this is worlds apart. What do you mean by this?
Yeah, I mean, Karen, if we look at the way we thought about organizations in the last century and the way we're starting to think about organizations in this century, it's not just a small change. There's really been I would call it a revolution in thinking. And the primary difference is that 20th century thinking about how an organization works, or how we should think about how an organization works, was based in an industrial model, which came out of the Industrial Revolution, based in the idea that an organization is to be seen, which is inorganic. It doesn't think for itself. And the kind of object in 20th century organizations was really to make human beings function like cogs in a machine and kind of manage them together, almost like the kind of Ford Motor Company factory conveyor belt idea. If you think about the term line manager, for example, what is the notion of this line? Really like a factory line. So you've got these people on the line producing product which is going to be distributed, and then a manager of that line. Very machine in its metaphor, industrial in its metaphor, factory in its metaphor, and really saw people as objects that needed to be managed, manipulated, controlled. I think the key word there is really controlled. And the better you could control your human resources, your human capital, just think of these ideas, human resources, human capital. You needed to control them so that they kind of do the work in their job descriptions. And the better you could control them against your sort of strategic plan and your operating model, the better it would go. Now, we should not think poorly about this model. I mean, that model created the most prosperous century in human history, which was the 20th century, on many counts. But what we're seeing in the 21st century is we are seeing a revolution in thinking. We're seeing a change, a fundamental change in the basic notion of what an organization is, from an inorganic machine model to a living system. And that's really the idea that an organization is a living system. And I think that living systems are very different to inorganic systems. Living systems have different rules about, what they do, how they work, and how they can be managed. And that really transforms the way we see the role of a leader and what leadership is in a living system. And so that's really where the big change lies.
So I have a question. So basically, in the 20th century, you had your CEO, and he was the visionary, and he basically worked out what the strategy of the company was and the goals, etc., etc. And then he told his leaders, all right, go down and implement this into your team. So if we have this traditional thinking, how do we now get the CEO to change his thinking, or is he still the person that comes up with the vision and then allows the various, say, teams to now work out how they're going to basically make it come to life?
Okay, so it's an excellent question. I mean, I use the metaphor of a gardener. Agricultural model metaphors are actually much better for leaders in the 21st century than we realize. If you think about a gardener as the CEO, or a manager for that matter of any kind, What does a gardener do? Does a gardener make the garden grow? Clearly not. I mean, a garden grows because it's alive. It's a living system. It will grow no matter what you do. Okay. So then, is there even a role for a gardener? Yes, of course there's a role for it. But what is that role? It is to manage the garden by creating the conditions in the garden for the garden to grow in a particular way, creating guidelines. So, for example, in a garden, you might put, you might prune a tree, you might create a division between one area and another. So you are guiding the garden in a direction, but the garden is self-aware and it's growing in a particular way. And there's certain things that you can and can't do. There's also the weather. So sometimes you will protect when the sun is too bright. Sometimes you will add water when there's not enough water. But the sense that you're in control of the garden's growing is released. If I picked one of the many differences, the most important difference in leadership in the 21st century works around the notion of control. In the previous century, the more senior you are, the higher your rank in the organization, the more you imagined you could exert control. In a living system, what you do is you create the conditions for the living system to, of its own accord, create and deliver value. A simple example, the idea of a vision, creating a vision of sorts. In a 20th century company, the CEO would come with his or her own vision, or the executive team's vision, and then set that vision, and then others would follow into it. A 21st century company, one would actually co-create a vision with the company itself by engaging and asking people what their thinking is. And the executives would then curate that thinking with their own and create a shared vision. The difference between a shared vision and my vision, which you must live into. It's a simple example. Of course, in 20th centuries, some of the leaders didn't even have visions. They just had sort of control functions with a strategy document, which, thankfully by the end of the last century, we were getting rid of that simplistic, mechanistic thinking and moving into more purpose-led organizations. So you see how popular now purpose is, purpose-led organization. Purpose-led, the reason purpose is so popular is because it's a human, it's a living thing. Like a human being doesn't have a strategy for their life. Like you don't have a strategy for your life. You've got a dream for your life. But you have this document, like this 50-page document that you wrote for your life that you keep in a cupboard somewhere, and you're following it. Well, you get the odd crazy person that's done that, but it's not exactly the most common thing. So you're driven by a living sense of a dream for your life. And purpose, a human being has purpose, and that really is a powerful driver. A machine has got no purpose. A machine doesn't have a sense of purpose, doesn't have values, it doesn't have a vision for itself, isn't trying to find a way of having a dream lived in their life. And if you treat human beings like machines, you get machine-like behavior. Whereas if you treat human beings as they are, which is a living system that can think for themselves, together as well as on their own, and you create the conditions for them to be able to enact that, you can have extraordinary outcomes, and we do have extraordinary outcomes. Another example is learning, for example. If you tell people what to do, which is what we used to do in the old model, you tell them what to do. What happens to learning? Learning actually goes down. The more I tell you what to do, the less you learn, ironically. But the more I ask you to think about what you could do, the more you learn. And that is the difference between the two styles. Creating freedom through acts of leadership or living systems as in human beings to dream into and create is the new instruction for leadership.
So I see three barriers around this. Basically, I think that how do organizations deal with this new reality? How does the individual, brain deal with this new complexity? And then also, if you're in a team, we're so accustomed as a child to be getting a reward at the end, like getting a trophy if we swim in a gala and we win. Will these barriers be overcome, or do you think that there are strategies around this new leadership that help overcome these barriers? I mean, does one then train or coach the actual leaders? How does this work?
So, well, let's start with the first one, which is what is the mind shift that's required? So, luckily, turns out that in the last century, the living systems that were actually delivering the value in this machine model were still living systems. I mean, it's not as if they weren't living systems before. They were. We were just treating them in a very misaligned way. So the real task is to actually stop doing certain things rather than start doing certain things, to allow it to occur. Let me give you a simple example. In the past, you would find, well, it's still today, we find that people manage their manager. That's actually the truth. This is one of these, like things that no one wants to say. Most of the time, you're actually managing your manager, manage you. And you're trying to stop him or her get out of your way. Telling them what they want to hear so that you can say, okay, fine, I've done that, given them what they want. Now can I actually get back to doing what I really need to be doing to get this to work? And people laugh when I say this. They're all over, I speak all over. They always laugh because they know that it's true, okay? How much of the interaction between you and your leader is really about making your leader feel better about what's going on because of their control needs, as opposed to really engaging about what's the value creating activity here and how is it really going to improve. And you'll find that ratio is way, way out of whack. So we've got this crazy situation which we have to stop, which is that we service the control needs of our leaders. And in spite of the fact that it has very low value, value creating result in what's really going on. So here's my first thing. I learned this from someone in fact, in Israel, there was a guy I picked this up from, and he said, talent that can be managed is not real talent, and real talent doesn't need to be managed. Okay? And I thought that was brilliant. You know, we're spending a lot of time as leaders trying to manage people to make them do better, be better, whatever. And most of the time, what you should be doing is get the hell out of the way. So my first instruction to leaders in the new living system model is get out of the way. You're in the way. You're a pain. And all your control needs, and not only they're not helping the situation, they're making it, they're slowing it down, they're demotivating the people. Okay, half the time they don't even need you. And the other half, where they do need you, you're showing up badly because you're trying to get them to feed your control needs rather than trying to work out how you can support them. So there's the first, like, wake up and get out of the way. You can write that down. Marc Kahn says, first rule of leadership in the 21st century is wake up and get the hell out of the way of your people.
I'm writing it down. All right. So then how do we address then this reward? Because, you know, we go to school, like I said, and we actually want to reward people. And so we give the child the star, or we give the sportsman his medal. Now we are in the workplace, we work as a team, but everybody wants this power to stand out from the crowd. How do you manage this team to work together and not one person wanting the power to override everybody else and stand out from the crowd?
Okay, it's a great question. So the principle to offer here in living systems is self-organization. living systems organize themselves. If you leave them alone, they self-organize. What does self-organize mean? Like if you take a group of people and you put them in a room and they don't know each other, and you don't give them a leader, or you don't give them a task, you don't give them anything, you just stick them in the room and you give no instructions. They don't sit there and do nothing, which is what would happen with a machine. It would just be dead. What would they start doing? They start self-organizing. They start talking to each other. They start making meaning out of why we are here, even if nothing has been provided to them. And they begin some type of activity. They make it up and they create it. That's a living system. So when it comes to reward, for example, again, we try and control the whole game. We try and say to the team, okay, we've decided, here's the carrot and here's the stick and here's this, and you're going to get this. And we presuppose what drives them. Like the so-called balanced scorecard, you know, this weighted balanced KPI scorecard. That is to me, that's the crescendo of the machine model of the 20th century. The fantasy that you create this framework, where you reward with little bits of cheese, tiny bits of directives in weighted and balanced ways to force the individual to work in a particular way. My personal view is those things should be taken and burned, and we shouldn't even give them a funeral because they don't even deserve one. Anyone who tells me that they have been historically motivated to really create value because they were on a weighted balanced scorecard, they need to be checked into a psychiatric institute. People are not motivated by being controlled in that way. This is not to say that clarity about where you should focus and alignment between people and between you and your manager around what's important to focus on isn't required. That is required. But there's this sort of granularity of control to create reward that was really this balanced weighted scorecard craziness. Most people just spent their time kind of doing what they needed to do to get that scorecard. And in fact, they would sometimes do the wrong things that they knew were wrong because the scorecard reduced the complexity of work to in such a reduced form that they would do the wrong thing just to get their bonus rather than doing what they thought they should be doing. So let me give you a simple example. In a previous life, I was the MD of a management consultancy, a subsidiary of a group, and I myself was on a weighted balanced scorecard being rewarded for certain things. And one of the line items of this madness of control, which I would get rewarded from in this old model, was that it was attendance at business development forums where all the MDs of the subsidiaries used to get together and compare clients and try and cross-sell. And it said there that there were, I think, 10 meetings a year, and I had to attend 8 or more to get like X percentage of my bonus. And then if I attended 7 or 6 or less and less, my bonus had a sort of discounting as it went along. Seemed like a clever thing. Some genius came up with this control as a CEO and said, I want all the MDs to come to these things and I'll reward them for coming to it because it will drive cross-selling. So we put it as a KPI in the thing. It's like, oh, brilliant. So clever. Sounds clever. Okay, let's see how clever it is. One day, which was the next day, I get a call from the president of, in this case, it was the president of the Coca-Cola company, and he from his assistant to say he would like to see me for some possible consulting work that morning, and he knows it's at short notice, but could I make it at around 10 a.m. was the next day. And I said to her, I looked at her, now I know, basically, I'm on 7 out of 10 attendances at these business development forums, and there's an 8th one the next morning, and it's the last one of the year. Okay? And I know on my scorecard that if I don't go, I'm going to get less pay. So I say to her, look, does it have to be in the morning? I do have something else in the morning. Could possibly you make it in the afternoon? So now I say that only because I want to go to this business development forum. Think of the irony. Business development. God. Okay. She says, okay, I'll get back to you. I think he's only got the morning, but I'll try and I'll call you back in an hour. She doesn't call me back. Okay. The next morning I sleep. It comes the next morning. I send her an email and there's no response. And I think, oh, okay. And I go to the business development meeting and I get my 8 out of 10 on my little scorecard. I discover a week later that 2 consultants were contacted, of which I was one. The other consultant was there at 10 o'clock. I wasn't, and we lost the work. So much for business development. Okay, thanks very much. But you want to know something? I got my 0.78% of my bonus because I hit my 8 out of 10 on that thing. Now, that's an example of the madness of that. It reduces the complexity of the work and is so distrusting, based in a mistrust of people's ability to use their discretion to determine what's important and what's not important in a living way in creating value. And so in the new system, we would talk about business development is a KPI. It's important. And then we would talk about how you have to use your discretion to create the right balance between all the complex things you've got to do that business development. And we would focus on outcomes. We would say, how well did you do in the past year with regards to developing the business, for which we will reward you. And we won't reward you like X percentage, this and this and this. We will work out in retrospect, in a sort of due diligence, what was important, and we'll use a discretion through an engagement process around what value created and how to determine the reward. Everyone's going, oh, you can't control that. Exactly. You shouldn't control it. And that's the mindset that has to change.
So then are you saying then that you would measure teams then as opposed to individuals? That's what the new thinking is in the 21st century.
You could measure both. But it's more about how you measure. So number one is, we know that living systems are very unpredictable. So if you want to look at chaos theory, if you're interested in chaos theory, it's a fantastic documentary. It's free. It's called The Secret Life of Chaos. It's a BBC documentary. It's free on the internet. A fantastic documentary about the new science, which is the science of living systems. And when you look at chaos theory, which is really the way living systems work, we see that because the variables are almost infinite, if not infinite, in a living system, it is not possible to predict what's going to happen. There's something called the butterfly effect. Now, the butterfly effect is used in science, in chaos theory, which is, again, I say the science of living systems, is the idea that a small, tiny change in a living system can have enormous effects in the broader system. It comes from the idea that if a butterfly flaps, when it comes to weather, system of weather, when a butterfly flaps its wings in Mexico, it can cause a thunderstorm to occur in Brazil. And that's literally the case in the weather, which is why the weather is very difficult to predict. Now, there's some predictions you can make, but you can't guarantee them. And suddenly they can change. So when we look at this way of measuring a living system where you predict how it's going to be is problematic, because the change that can happen is so extraordinary that you have to be a little bit more open with how you are going to measure. You have to allow for an engagement of understanding on what's happened. So let's take this virus that we're in now and how it's affected markets. So if you said to someone, listen, you're going to sell so many flights as a travel agent, okay, and I'm going to reward you X for doing it. And then the virus comes and shuts down the airlines. Sorry, you get naught. I mean, how could I have been measured on selling something where there are no planes flying? How could I control? I can't control that, right? So now you have to go back to us and say you're getting naught. Okay, maybe you can say you're getting naught. But then you have to ask yourself, is that a sensible response? Because for 7 months or 8 months of the year, they sold beautifully, or 10 months of the year, and then the bottom just fell out of the last 2 months, which meant they dropped below the kind of target they had. Now you're giving them nothing, and they're like, well, what about the 7 months where I sold my butt off for you? I get nothing for that. What makes sense? And what makes sense is that, okay, hold on a second. For a year, given what's happened, let's find an amount that is sensible with it. Do you fire everyone the moment that something goes wrong because they don't hit their targets? It's the same. That there's a grand old story about learning with this, about the fellow who, he he makes a big mistake, he's a deal maker, and he makes a big mistake on a deal, meant well, but it didn't work out, and he loses the company $1 million. And he goes to the CEO and he says to the CEO, I've just come here. It's an error I made, but I tried my best. And I've lost the company $1 million. Here is my resignation. And I'm out. I'm accountable. I take the blame. Here's my resignation. And the CEO says to him, what are you, crazy? He says, what do you mean am I crazy? I thought that's the right thing to do. I'm going to fall on my sword and I've lost $1 million. The CEO says, I have just spent $1 million teaching you something in this company. That's what that lesson cost, $1 million. And now you're going to leave with all that learning. Thanks very much. See, and that's a living system idea. That's, in a 20th century model, you lost $1 million, you're gone. Put someone else in. But what you've lost is all the learning that came. And it cost you $1 million for that learning. And that's, it's different from a malicious act. I'm not talking about a malicious act. So you see that change in thinking. Same as with the old COO, CEO one, where the COO says, we can't spend all this money on learning for our people. What's going to happen if we, spend all this money on these people and, we don't make any money. And the CEO says, well, what's going to happen if we don't spend the money and the people learn nothing? And then what's going to happen? It's that contrary idea of what's important. One's in the machine model and the other is in the long-term model. You see it in redundancies as well. Let's just cut all the people. We're not making any money. We cut the people. Okay, then when the market returns, what are you going to do? See, so it's that sustainability approach to things.
Exactly. So that brings me to, because let's say now the world is getting faster and faster and faster. How do we create a company that's more agile to react to these different changes with this new thinking? Because now you're in a team, and within a team there are people that are positive and some are negative, and now you want to create a very agile company to move quickly.
So the notion of agility is useful, as you say. Excuse me. And why it's useful is, let's take the idea of, which is so popular at the moment. Every cousin and their assistant orange peeler is talking about future proofing. Future this, the Singularity University, this, the future. Okay? Let's take this idea of future proofing. Everyone is predicting the future. And the change is so fast, and you've got to know what's going on in the future and future-proof. The truth is, the future is unpredictable. It is not possible to future-proof. The amount of change is exponential, and we don't know what's going to happen. That's the truth. We don't know. Even a broken clock is right twice a day. Got the right time twice a day, a broken clock, but it's broken. So when you get all this futurist planning stuff, okay, which is long-term strategy documents and working what else we should do, twice out of every 100, 2 are going to be correct and will declare themselves geniuses. It's like economists are the same. I mean, economists are doing all these predictions. I remember, we had a great economist of ours some years ago, and he made this huge presentation. It was very entertaining in print, and he said the euro is going to be the new benchmark currency for the world. You've got to get out of the dollar and go into the euro. 6 months later, the euro just went through the floor. And I caught him in the canteen. I said to him, hey, I love that presentation you did 6 months ago, but I mean, what's the deal? And he said to me, well, markets are markets. You can't really call them markets. It's these things are unpredictable. I'd say, okay, but if it had been true, you would have said you were right and you're a genius. And he just laughed, and we had a good laugh, and it was funny. But the thing is, you can't call the future. What does agility really mean? It means being future fit, not future proof. The idea of future fit is that what you do is you work on yourself right now. How flexible are you? How adaptable are you to change? How open-minded is your environment? How much control have you stuck into your system that to move it now or change it takes you 6 months to make a small change when we've got this rapidly changing world? So now if we are future fit, means right now we're very flexible and adaptive and open, and we're trying new things and we're experimenting. And this allows us to deal with whatever change may come in the future without having to plan and, for it in a particular way, which is again a living system idea. And that's the key to leadership. Instead of controlling by predicting the future and making a plan and setting everyone on a path, it's say, what are the conditions we need to be in now that you can all be awake to what's happening to adjust to that? And I'll give you a simple story. If we look at the tsunami that hit the Fukushima power plant, created the worst nuclear disaster in history, okay, in Japan some years ago. When they did an analysis of why did that power plant break down from the tsunami, substantial studies were done as to what caused it, because it was designed to withstand a tsunami. The structural integrity of that power plant, from an engineering point of view, should have withstood that tsunami. So why didn't it? And it turned out that it was about, well, they concluded in these studies that it was culture. It was Japanese culture that caused the problem. They say, well, exactly what did that mean? Well, let's make it practical. What they discovered was that it's a very hierarchical culture, very, very high control, to the extent that the power distance, which is a technical term, between manager and subordinate, was such that you would not raise risks and concerns with your manager in that culture unless they were very serious, because you would not want to embarrass your manager. You would be seen to be kind of raising problems, and it wasn't appropriate to do so. So in that power plant, many people who saw very small risks, like cracks in pipes or in nuts or bolts or whatever it may be, or in systems or processes or things that needed to be changed, but it wasn't a huge thing. From their perspective at that individual level, it was a small risk. They tend not to escalate it, okay? When you added up all those small risks across all those people in an aggregated way, the structural integrity of the plant was compromised to the extent that it didn't withstand the tsunami. That's an example of a high control system, lots of hierarchy, power distance, which results in low agility and actually creates risk. So the best risk mitigators for future problems is to have people who feel they have a voice, even if they are junior in a system, to raise issues and challenge. And that's not going to happen in a high-controlled 20th century old model. So you get a flat structure or more equitable power relations, which results in a far more agile living system, which creates more possibilities for success. So again, get out the way, let people think, give them a voice. We talk about the needs of millennials. The needs of millennials are not the needs of millennials. The needs of millennials are the needs of 21st century human beings. We're just attributing it to an age group. We're forgetting that that's just the evolutionary process of our thinking. That's not about them, it's about us.
You did a very interesting TED talk around creating environments that allow people this freedom to speak out. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, I talk about in my TED talk, it's called Ordinary People, Extraordinary Performance. I talk about how we've been getting it wrong all these years when it comes to developing people, to recruiting people, developing people, getting people to perform. We've been getting it wrong. And where we've been getting it wrong is that we're stuck in the individual idea. We're stuck in the idea that what makes great performance is a special person. Like, go and find these specially talented people and recruit them by measuring their competence or their personality or whatever, and then stick them in your company. And if you can get enough of them, you're going to do brilliantly. And why that's wrong, and we know that it's wrong, why that's wrong is because it turns out that just because you fit a set of generic assumptions about what makes you talented doesn't mean you'll do well in context A or context B. Think how often it's the case that you select, let's take football, go around the world and select the 11 best football players at an individual level and put them in a team and make them play. You can't assume that they will be the best team in the world. You might find a team with a lot of other players who aren't at an individual level as good as those are, but they play together in a particular way that allows them to beat that team. Similarly, we see a great CEO or a great leader in company A, and so we recruit them and move them across to company B, and they are rubbish in company B. Why is that? It's because we've been blind to what the real conditions are for performance. The real conditions are the interface between the individual and the context they are in. It's really in the chemistry between the two that gives rise to, to that environment. I mean, if you took Elon Musk and you made him the head of the regulatory authority for financial services, it's going to be a disaster. Okay, I think many of us would really appreciate it, by the way, but it'll be a disaster. Similarly, if you took an excellent head of the financial regulator and put him or her as the head of SpaceX, that thing's never going to launch from the ground. It's never getting off the ground. You can forget about it. So, well, what does that mean? Is it one a good or a bad? You see that point. Now, if we take it another step further, leadership development, or the idea of developing people. I mean, we take people out of companies and we stick them on these leadership programs. And then they learn all these like cool things. And then we stick them back in the company and we think it's going to go better. But the research on this is conclusive. I mean, it doesn't actually give much of a return on investment. It doesn't. Okay, why is that? It's because it's totally disconnected from the context that it's really in. I mean, I use the metaphor in the talk of a fish tank. It's like there's this fish tank and there's all these fish in the fish tank and they really start swimming really badly and they're no longer performing tricks in the little wheel and they're looking worse for wear. So you take them out of the fish tank and you clean them and you teach them some tricks and you check their health and you fix their health and then you put them back in the fish tank. And sure enough, they swim a bit better. And you keep doing this. You take them out, you clean them, you fix their health, you give them a little holiday and then you put them back. They swim a bit better. But what happens is every time you do it, they swim a bit better for a couple of days, if that, and then very quickly they start to become lackluster again and they're all over the place. Why is that? Because the idiots who are doing this are not checking the water in the fish tank. It's the water in the fish tank that's all messy and toxic. That's the problem. And you keep taking the fish out of it and fixing them. You stick them back in the toxic water, and it's not long before they get messed up again. And that's what we have failed to do. We failed to look at organizations and say, let's look at the water in the fish tank. Yes, it does help to, look after the individual fish, but it's actually a very low return because you keep having the same problems. We see this all over the place, this mistake, because it turns out if you take ordinary fish and you put them in an extraordinary fish tank, they perform amazingly. Whereas if you find the greatest, most brilliant fish in the world and you stick them in crappy water in a fish tank, they don't perform. So the real equation should be, first and foremost, create the conditions for the garden, create the water in the fish tank. That's the job of leadership. That's the job of human concern when it comes to organizations. When you've got a great fish tank with water in it, then you don't have to find the most brilliant people in the world. You just can take regular good people and you are going to have extraordinary outcomes, and exponentially so. And that's why we've been getting it wrong. But we carry on, we carry on. It's a madness.
So your book, which I'll be very honest, I haven't read, Coaching on the Access, but I know you speak about the access and you go, there's the left and the right side. So how would you describe, these sort of methods within your book that could lead to this new way of leadership?
Okay, so the term coaching on the axis is an important concept. It's the idea of a relationship or a connection or an axis between an individual and an organization and between people in an organization. When we look at living systems, we see that living systems are about relationship. You could switch the word axis to relationship. So that book was actually a textbook for postgraduate training in management, leadership, coaching, etc. Excuse me. So what's meant by that is if you take the term coaching on the axis, the most important word is on in that term because it's a locator. It tells you where to locate your concerns. And you're locating your concerns in the connection between the parts. Because it's actually the way that a system connects between the parts that gives rise to the outcome. Let me use a simple example everyone can relate to. Let's look at a marriage. When a marriage doesn't work, whose fault is it? The wife or the husband? Okay, don't answer that, Karen. Okay, but when a marriage doesn't work, whose fault is it? They'll always say it's the other person's fault. But the truth is, in most cases, it's neither part's fault. It's the way they come together. And how do we know this? Because those parties will divorce and they will find other partners and both have a successful marriage in many cases, not always. Then you say, well, then why is that? It's because the way they connect, the axis between them is really where it works or not to create the value that comes about through a marriage. The same in an organization. We need to look at the way people come together. So let's look at the Elon Musk leading a financial services regulator. That alignment, that axis is going to be extremely difficult to be successful. Similarly, if the head of a financial regulator runs SpaceX, that connection, their orientation, and that orientation is not going to come together too well. Let's take Winston Churchill, arguably one of the greatest leaders of the 20th century. You know, before the war, he was regarded as being a very, very poor leader. He was, in many respects, relegated to the margins of political life. But during the war, one of the greatest leaders of all time. And then after the war, you know, not the best peacetime leader, and eventually kind of, voted out. So is he or is he not a great leader? He is a great leader, but he's a great leader in a particular fish tank. Does that make sense? And that's really where the key lies. We need to have this idea of looking at the connections between the parts, the relationships between the parts, and how they work together, then being focused on the individual parts themselves. Back to that fish tank, we were too focused on the individual fish, finding them and then sticking them into the fish tank, rather than looking at the context, which is the connections between the fish and the environment that they're in. That works. And you could take the fish example further. If you take a carnivorous fish and you put it in a tank with fish that, it's going to eat, then you're surprised that it doesn't work. And again, so it's the way they work together. Back to the sports team. Not just go find the 10 or 11 best football players and stick them together wherever it might be. It's working out which players are likely to work together. How well do they know each other? What is the game that we're going to play? Who are we playing? And then working it from that point of view.
Okay, so we're coming to the end now, Mark. So I wanted on a final message. If you had to give advice to a young entrepreneur who's about to start his first organization, what would you tell him to be aware of, or how would you tell him to set up the culture within his organization? Because everybody starts with these missions and visions, etc., but they're all just statements. So what would you tell a young entrepreneur that he should do?
Okay, so again, I would have to say, what industry? What's the idea? Where are you going? Because the advice would be tailored to what the nature of the task is. So if they've got a bit of code that they're going to, create a bit of software with and sell that, it's going to be very different to if they're going to provide services to people around the world. So that's the answer. My first thing is understand what you're trying to do, who you're trying to provide it to. Attune yourself to that. Don't come with presuppositions. It's got to be this way. It's got to be that. I have to do a mission. I don't have to do a mission. I must do this. I can't do that. How do you know? Anything is possible. Be as flexible by thinking together with what's happening to create a sensible response. Like I had a meeting the other day with someone who leads in learning at universities, and they said to me, "Well, what do you think about servant leadership as a model, the servant leadership model?" And I said, why do we have to have a model? We've had this whole history of models: authentic leadership, servant leadership, distributed leadership, charismatic leadership. They have this little model that this is how you should be. The truth is, How do you know how you have to be? Because you haven't attuned to what's required. Maybe you need to be in a servant kind of way, but maybe actually in that moment with the startup, you need to be very strong and say, this is how I want it, because you're clear on your vision, you're kind of Steve Jobs like, and you said it how it is, and you're not interested if people don't get it. Simultaneously, it might be that in that context, that's the worst thing you can do. And the best thing you can do is to say, how do you all think this should look? Let's co-create it. And you can't be sure which it is. Some advice to an entrepreneur is especially a young entrepreneur, don't get stuck on these models and the latest this and the latest that. Tune in, be open to doing anything that makes sense by getting connected to what's happening. And then being informed by all this information, pick what makes sense in that time. And then be ready to drop it and try something else a moment later.
Well, Marc, I just want to thank you. You know, your insights have been unbelievable. Giving us your time has been fantastic. And I really, really want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. And to my audience, thank you for listening. And we'll be back shortly to bring you another show about new insights and walk with passion. Keep safe. Thank you.